September 13th, 1918. Saint-Mihiel, France. There's a brief lull in fighting right now, so two of my fellow soldiers and I are gathered by some sandbags playing some cards. One of them is Corporal Matthews, who has become quite a good friend of mine. He's from Tennessee, while I'm from Missouri, so we've bonded quite well, both being from the South. We've been stuck in this trench for a few days now, gunfire and artillery constantly filling the air and our minds with dread. For some, that dread has proven to be too much. Last night, Sergeant Franklin was found dead in the telephone bunker with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, a photograph of his wife laying on his chest. As for the rest of us, we do what we can to continue fighting on. As Corporal Matthews reshuffles the cards, I notice a silver figure the size of my fist fly over the trench and hit the wall before rolling towards us. As I am the only one facing that direction, I am the only one who sees it. "Grenade!" I yell, but it's a little too late for the other two. I'm blown backwards, my vision blurring slightly as the other two before me erupt into several pieces. As I'm laying on my back, dizzy from the blast, I see a unit medic run over to check the other two. He doesn't spend much time, as it is visibly obvious that there isn't much left to save. Next, I see him stand over me with an outstretched hand. I take it as he pulls me up, back onto my feet. "All right, Williams, how many fingers?" "Okay, where are you from?" As the medic asks me these questions, I hear the fighting ensue around me once more. My dizziness fades and my vision sharpens once again. I quickly turn from the grisly sight of what's left of my friends to see one of my superiors, First Lieutenant Becker, rapidly approaching from behind. I turn to face him. "Williams, we need you up on the Browning." "Yes, sir," I reply, before sprinting over to the corner of the trench's end and mounting the turret. As the combat continues, no man's land, the area between our trench and that of the Germans, is filled with smoke from all of the constant artillery fire. Noticeably, there comes a time when the Germans cease their fire abruptly, dissipating some of the smoke in no man's land. It's then that, from my vantage point, I notice a clear white figure pressed against the dirt. It's a dress. "Lieutenant!" I scream over the loud shots that continue from our side before Lieutenant Becker comes running over. When he reaches me, I point to the dress out on the ground. His face twists in confusion before he yells, "Hold your fire!" Then silence ensues as the gunfire ceases, everyone's heads turning towards us. A second or so passes before the figure in the dress out in no man's land slowly folds up from the ground, its wearer standing up, frantically looking around and quickly placing her shaking arms up above her head. My lieutenant and I exchange looks of confusion as he pauses for a moment, undoubtedly wondering how a woman even got out there. After careful consideration, he calls out, "Calloway, come here." Private First Class Calloway runs over from his position a few yards away. "Yes, sir," he reports. "You and Williams both go out there and bring her here through the side." This order doesn't surprise me, as it is always the lower ranks who are ordered to venture into no man's land when necessary. "Sir," Sergeant Phillips, the lieutenant's right-hand man, cuts in from a few feet away. "We don't know what she's doing. She could be an infiltrator sent out from the Germans." The lieutenant turns to face him. "I considered that, Phillips. We'll know soon enough through interrogation. But for now, we will bring her here. No man's land is no place for a civilian, let alone a lady. Let's muster some humanity." He turns back towards Calloway and I before giving us a nod. "On it, sir," I say as Calloway and I run over to the end. As we cut the wire and slowly walk through to exit onto higher ground, I look over to see German troops peeking out over their cover, rifles aimed carefully at us. Calloway and I raise our hands, rifles slung across our chests as we slowly climb out, Calloway pointing at the lady before we slowly begin walking over. The enemy troops continue aiming their rifles at us, but don't attempt to fire. When we reach the lady, she is still shaking with her arms up. I gently place my hand on her back and guide her back towards our trench, while Calloway takes up the rear, walking backwards with his hand on the grip of his rifle, ready to raise it if needed. We quickly make it back. Once we re-enter the trench, 2 other troops rush over to rewire the opening behind us, while we usher the woman, still shaking, over to the lieutenant, who is standing over by the entrance to the telephone bunker. As we approach him, the fighting ensues once again, the rifles and artillery filling the surrounding air with near-deafening noise. "I'll take it from here," the lieutenant tells us. "Back to your positions." "Yes, sir," Calloway and I say at the same time before I run over to the turret once again. For about another half hour, the combat continues before temporarily winding down again. I'm scanning my sector of fire for enemy troops when I notice the lieutenant walking out of the telephone bunker looking flustered, along with our French and German translators. Sergeant Phillips walks back from his position to speak with him. I see the lieutenant shaking his head in conversation before I step back from the turret and begin stretching. I lean in, my curiosity getting the best of me, to try to listen in on what they're saying. "Nothing," the lieutenant tells him. "Not a single word. We don't even know what language she speaks," he goes on, motioning towards the 2 translators flanking either side of him. Then, I witness the lady's head pop out of the bunker's entrance, looking around before the lieutenant notices behind him and prepares to usher her back inside. As he steps towards her, her eyes meet mine and she quickly points to me, stopping the lieutenant in his tracks. Confused, he looks over at me and then back at her as her mouth opens and she speaks for the first time.
"Him!"
she says, now excitedly and on edge, her eyes bulging with extreme intensity. The lieutenant looks at Sergeant Phillips quickly before turning to me. "Williams, come here," he says before I walk over to him. "Do you know this woman somehow?" "No, sir," I reply, feeling incredibly bewildered. The lady looks at the lieutenant and says,
"I need talk to him,"
in broken English. He looks at me once more, pausing before saying, "Phillips, mount the Browning for a bit." "Yes, sir," Phillips responds before running to position himself at the turret. The lieutenant then looks at her, pointing at the bunker, and says, "Go back in. We'll be in there in just a minute." She looks at him and nods slightly before turning and going back inside the bunker, away from us. He then turns to face me with a quizzical look. "That's the first thing she's said this entire time. Are you sure you don't recognize her from anywhere?" "No, sir," I reply, confident in my answer. "Not at all." "Perhaps she'd feel more comfortable talking if you're in the room," he goes on. "Come on, let's go." I follow him inside and we stand in front of the now very mysterious lady. "All right, miss," the lieutenant starts. "So you can speak English." The lady shoots him an angry look and says,
"Him!"
again pointing to me. "What about him?" he replies.
"I talk only him."
I barely even notice him look over at me again as my eyes are locked on her, trying to decipher what could possibly be going on. He looks at her once more. "Very well," he says before turning around and walking towards the entrance, motioning for me to follow him. I quickly catch up to him until we're a short distance away from her. "Look, I don't know what's going on," he says, "but she is hell-bent on talking to you and you only." He pauses again, analyzing me for a brief second, and continues. "You go on and get whatever you can out of her. Come out and report directly to me whatever she tells you. Understood?" I nod my head and say, "Understood, sir." He turns to give her a nod before walking out of the bunker, leaving me and her alone. I turn back around to face her. "Okay, it's just us," I say, attempting to be reassuring. "Who are you? How'd you get here?"
"Corporal Matthews."
She starts, her voice suddenly void of the accent that had previously existed. This is yet another curveball that leaves me once again stunned. "What?" I respond.
"Corporal Matthews sent me here with an urgent message, for your ears only."
My head is spinning at the speed of light. I'm finding it difficult to respond to that. "Ma'am, first off, Matthews was blown up earlier today. He's gone. How did you know him, and what happened to your accent? Who are you?
That accent is what I needed to lay low until I got you one-on-one. You can call me Alice.
She's gotta be a spy, I think to myself. Okay, Alice, where are you from? I ask again.
A different realm.
She replies.
Matthews joined me after his untimely departure. He reunited with someone you know as Sergeant Franklin, who had departed before him.
I am too stunned to speak. I turn to make sure that no one is listening behind me before turning back around. What the hell are you talking about? They're both dead. How did you know them? And again, how did you get here? It's difficult for me at this point to hide the frustration in my voice.
Again, they entered my realm after departing from this one. I'm a vessel between the living and the dead, a medium, if you will.
Utterly in shock, my eyes wide, I say, "What?"
I traversed to this realm a long way. I got here for the purpose of communicating a message from Matthews directly to you. You still don't believe me.
My eyes are piercing through hers.
Tell me this. How else would I know the identities of the two who had just died? How else could I materialize on the battlefield in such a way?
My face is now blank as I attempt to process every other possibility.
Are you ready to listen?
I nod slowly.
When Matthews entered my realm, he was reunited again with Sergeant Franklin, who described that his death was not a suicide.
She pauses as my heart sinks. Not a suicide, I think to myself. He was shot. That could only mean one thing. She goes on.
Franklin walked into this very bunker at night to find Lieutenant Becker on the phone describing your force's plans to German officers on the other line. This whole time, Lieutenant Becker has been sympathetic to the German cause in this war and was caught engaging in this treasonous act of sabotage by Sergeant Franklin. The lieutenant turned to see him listening in before shooting him to prevent him from speaking about what he'd seen. It was covered up and staged to look like a suicide.
I'm unable to speak, my mind racing and heart beating quickly, trying to desperately find a reason not to believe her words.
Matthews wanted me to speak only with you because he trusts you more than anybody. He says you would know what to do with the information.
A brief moment of silence follows before my mouth finally opens. Okay, I finally say. I believe you. Thank you. Her face still stoic, she nods and says,
You're welcome. There's unfortunately only one way to leave this realm once you enter, so I'll need to be on my way.
She looks over at some boxes of equipment in the corner before saying,
Walk out now. I won't put anybody in harm's way as I make my leave. I promise you. Tell the lieutenant that I thought you were from my village and that I couldn't remember where or what my own name was. Something to make me look crazy. I'll make my exit shortly.
My eyes look down at the floor, still processing everything. Then I turn around and exit the bunker to be greeted by the lieutenant outside. I noticed that the conversation was so insane that I hadn't even noticed that the combat had resumed. "Williams," the lieutenant says. "What'd she say? Anything of value?" "No, sir," I begin, putting on the act of a lifetime by trying to swallow back all the intense, burning hatred I now feel towards him. She said I was from her village, but couldn't remember where or even what her own name was. He nods slowly before saying, "Poor girl. She's probably in shock. I don't know how she got here, but I'm going to get on the line and get her out. Thank you, Williams. Go relieve Sergeant Phillips and resume your position." "Yes, sir," I reply before doing as I'm ordered. The fighting continues on for almost another hour before another brief lull occurs. I notice some movement behind and to the right of me, far outside the bunker towards the tree line. I take out my binoculars and peer over to see two uniformed men dressed in full battle gear about 200 meters away, standing to the side of the trees, barely visible. "Lieutenant!" I call out. The lieutenant walks up to me before I hand him the binoculars and point in the direction towards the men. "Those are the U.S. Marshals. They're here to escort the lady out of the area." he says as he lowers the binoculars and hands them back to me. Williams, you and Calloway walk her out from the trench and bring her to them. Yes, sir, I respond. He walks down from my position and goes into the bunker while I inform Calloway of our mission. The lieutenant reappears outside of the bunker with Alice by his side. Calloway and I walk over to the two before I take Alice by the hand and we lead her towards a different exit out the back of the trench, a much safer and more concealed pathway than before. We begin walking across the field towards the tree line, Calloway taking up rear security once again. Alice and I exchange a few glances, but we both maintain silence as we trek through the grass. As we begin approaching the marshal's location, now close enough to clearly identify ourselves, Alice abruptly rips herself away from me and sprints away in an opposite direction, away from both the tree line as well as the trench. As she's running away, Calloway and I are frozen in place, and before either of us could react, we see her yank her dress up and pull something out from the inside of her undergarments. Now about 30 yards away, she turns and faces towards us with a metal ball in her hand. A grenade. Her face is like stone as she activates it, holding it in a tightly clenched fist before it goes off, filling the air with a large mixture of red and brown, leaving tattered white cloth fluttering to the ground. In that instant, I know just what to do. As Calloway turns to me, mouth agape, I begin sprinting towards the marshals. Calloway, who must be incredibly confused, trails behind me at a lesser speed. I sprint until I reach the two marshals in the tree line. Hey, what was that? Was that the woman? Where did she get the explosive? One of them asks frantically. Their faces are both locked in amazement of the scene they had just witnessed. Yeah, that was her, I say. Listen, I have something urgent to inform you about. Calloway is now standing beside me, looking just as confused as the marshals. I go on to explain how Sergeant Franklin was murdered by our lieutenant, who was conspiring with German officers in acts of treason. I leave out the fact that Alice was my source. The two marshals are now listening intently, their faces still expressing utter bewilderment before I hear footsteps running up behind us. I turn to see Lieutenant Becker trotting up to us, his rifle in his hands. I heard an explosion, he says. Williams, what is going on? The two marshals gather themselves and immediately step out of the trees towards the lieutenant. Lieutenant Becker, one of them says, drawing his weapon. Place your weapon on the ground. Looking confused, the lieutenant does as he is told. The second marshal steps up and handcuffs him from behind as the other one continues. You are under arrest under the suspicion of treason. The lieutenant's face turns boiling red with anger as the marshal who cuffed him walks him into the trees and out of sight. I look at Calloway, whose face is totally blank, undoubtedly still processing what's going on. The marshal standing before us says, We'll send in an officer to replace him shortly. In the meantime, the second in command is in charge. Got it? Yes, sir, I respond. The marshal gives us both a nod before turning around and disappearing into the trees, following the other two. Calloway turns to look at me, wide-eyed, before I say, We'd better get back. During the walk back, Calloway says, So let me get this straight. First, we have this random woman who appears out of nowhere and comes into our trench before blowing herself up when being taken to safety. Then I hear that our lieutenant is a traitorous son of a bitch engaging in espionage. What a crazy couple of days in this hellhole. Yeah, I say as we approach the trench before turning around to take one last look at the scattered specks of red and white cloth in the dirt now distantly behind us. You're telling me.